Welcome to the WSPA Policy Governance Orientation. The WSPA's Board of Directors has elected to utilize the policy governance model as our governance structure. The purpose of this presentation is to provide board members with a working knowledge of policy governance to enhance board member effectiveness. Policy governance provides significant advantages over more traditional governance structures. One advantage is the clear establishment of responsibility and accountability. Another is continuity from one board to another. With this structure, any new board member can find out how we operate as a board, what we're trying to accomplish in the present and in the future, and how our organization works as a whole. There's more consistency because we define what we want and don't want out of our organization, our board, and our CEO, and we write it all down so that when the current board leaves, the new board has a detailed record to assist them in their leadership role. Here are our objectives. Distinguish matters about which the board must lead. Certainly in our organization, the board and the CEO are leaders. There are areas where the board has to take the lead, and we will define those areas today. Learn how to clearly delegate from the board to the CEO. Each of us spends the vast majority of our time doing something else besides being board members. The CEO spends virtually all of his or her time on WSPA business. To be effective, we need to delegate. Learn to efficiently set and efficiently monitor expectations. Obviously, we need to let the CEO know what we expect, and monitoring is crucial for any board. Note the key word here is efficiently. Boards can get so focused on monitoring that they forget to focus on the purposes and achievements for the members. Before we delve into policy governance, let's talk for just a moment about dialogue and its importance for our board. A good definition of dialogue is finding out what other people think, which is a crucial part of leadership that involves active and attentive listening skills, which are utilized to see the other person's perspective on an issue. It should be a precursor to decision making. When the board promotes dialogue between its members, it does not mean everyone will agree, it only means everyone will agree to listen. So let's move on to the specifics of policy governance. Policy governance is based on several principles that you will need to become familiar with. The trust in trusteeship. Boards exist to act as the owner's representatives for an identifiable public. For some organizations, finding out who this is can be more difficult. For WSPA, it was rather easy. Either we represent our membership or we represent pharmacy as a whole. Our choice was to represent and hold ourselves accountable to our membership. We're accountable to our members no matter how rarely the board hears from them. Here's what our organizational structure looks like. As you can see, the board acts as trustees of the organization, acting on behalf of the members. The board interacts with the members to assist in determining organizational direction. We ascribe to the theory that the ideal number of bosses that anyone should have is one. The CEO can't get a clear direction from 1,000 different members. The board provides direction to the CEO on the members' behalf. This doesn't mean the CEO doesn't hear from the membership. To the contrary, the CEO will likely have the most member contact. Nonetheless, the CEO gets his direction from the board, not directly from the members. Principle 2. One voice. The board speaks with one voice or not at all. The CEO is accountable to the board as a whole, not to individual board members. That's the one voice part. But don't lose sight of the significance of the not at all segment of this principle. Information gathering and situational assessment plays a large part of board work. Often the board may discuss a topic several times, each time expanding board awareness, without taking specific action. Depending on the specific situation, the board may choose to act, or it may determine that the best course of action is not to act at all. When the board does act, we speak as one. This may mean that an individual may disagree with the action that the board has taken, but once the action has been taken, board members should at least support the process that led to the decision. Although Robert's Rules of Order are not a part of policy governance, they certainly can be used. It's helpful to have clear motions made for the record, voted upon, and placed in the minutes. Experience has taught us that by making and acting upon clear motions, we eliminate situations where a small group of members gets the mistaken idea that the board has acted simply because no one disagreed with them during discussion on a particular topic. If you want the board to act, you are strongly encouraged to make a motion to that effect. If the board accepts that motion, it's clear that they are speaking with one voice. Principle number 3 involves board decisions. Board decisions equal policy decisions. Policy is the value or perspective that underlies action. Different categories of policy exist. The category we will spend the most of our time in is ends. Other categories are important but not as dynamic. It's very important that we spend the majority of our time discussing issues that impact our members and the profession both now and in the future in order to determine what the direction for the association should be. Ends can be described as what good, for whom, at what worth. The first two are comparatively simple, but worth can be harder to get a handle on. There's a cost associated with each end. The cost can be expressed as a financial cost or a human resources cost or a combination of the two. It's valuable to find out what these costs are in establishing the worth of any ends policy. Obviously, for any organization to endure, it must be fiscally sound. Since resources are not without limit, the worth determination can provide a valuable tool in determining where the organization can afford to focus its resources. While worth is an important parameter for the board to consider, it does tend toward being somewhat nebulous. But nebulous or not, worth determinations can become a paramount issue when resources are limited. Ends policy is like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You never really finish. Ends are not the future of the WSPA, but rather they described what will the future benefits, impacts, and results of the WSPA be for its members, and what will they cost. So these are ends. Differentiation of ends from means is important in policy governance. So then what are the means? Means equal organizational practices, methods, and activities. Means are how statements, as contrasted to ends, which are what benefit statements. So, is the board involved in means? Absolutely. When we look at the categories of board policy, we see that governance process and board management delegation are the board's own means. It's imperative that the board be involved in these means. However, over-involvement in these areas can reduce the amount of time devoted to ends, and this can be problematic. The good news is that board means, once established, seldom need to be changed significantly. The other categories of board policy involve directions to the CEO. First via ends, which in our case would include our position statements as well, and secondly, directions to the CEO about staff means in the form of executive limitations. The board limits itself to the means necessary to do its job and establish what the CEO can't do. So when we talk about staff means, we're not telling the CEO what could or should be done. To the contrary, we are stating what cannot be done. So we try to stay out of staff means except to state what is not allowed, which are the executive limitations. Principle 4, decide larger issues first. This principle is referred to as logical containment. Imagine you have 8 bowls of varying sizes and you will need to move all 8 of them from one place to another. What's the most efficient way to do this? Note that in a nested set, you can adequately control all the bowls by controlling just one. Viewed from the top, these bowls would look something like this. The area inside the inner circles represent the CGO and the CEO areas of discretion. Note the term CGO refers to the Chief Governance Officer. In our board, this is the President, who also serves as the board chair. Principle 5 is proactive boards. Leadership is not just waiting for the staff to move forward and then voicing approval or disapproval. If we are providing the CEO with direction via our ends, we need to spend most of our time discussing what is the current reality and how can we make things better, both in the short term and also in the long term. So when we discuss what we want pharmacy to look like 10 years from now, this is an ends discussion. Once we've determined what benefit the organization should provide in the future, we can then consider defining an ends policy that describes this benefit and provides direction to the CEO. This brings us to Principle 6. Focus on the ends. Why do people join the WSPA? Or any organization for that matter? There are lots of specific answers, but in general, they join to make things better than they were before. End statements are how things will be better, not how will we make them better, which is staff means. It is very easy with our structure to get too involved in policies other than ends. The best guard against this is agenda input by the board. Make certain the chair puts discussion topics on the agenda that can or will have an effect on how pharmacy is practiced. Global ends policy is the broadest statement of an organization's reason for existence. In a trade organization, their global ends statement might state that they exist for the financial success of its members. The WSPA is essentially a service organization. We exist for the success and advancement of the practice of pharmacy and its practitioners in the state of Washington. Everything that the organization does fits under this global end statement. Ends are major categories of benefits that exist because of the organization. Each major category is broadly described. More specific categories line up under the broadest categories. The board can get as specific as it wants, but a board can get too specific. So how does the board determine if it's been specific enough? This is a key point. Perhaps the best method is to ask the CEO to tell you in writing as a part of a monitoring report what success looks like. Then, if anyone can articulate a situation where the CEO produces what was described and they would not be satisfied with the results, then the board can get more specific. Knowing the CEO interpretation of what successful performance of an end will look like is an invaluable tool for the board in that it prevents the board from having to drill down too narrowly when describing an ends. Here are our most current second-tier ends. Member pharmacy practitioners are knowledgeable and competent. The role of pharmacy professionals is valued by consumers, healthcare professionals, and government agencies. Member pharmacy practitioners are empowered for safe and ethical practice. Pharmacist compensation for providing patient care services is expanded or enhanced. We do get more specific in our ends. You can refer to your policy manual to see how specific the board has deemed as being appropriate. Ends are used as a measurement of the success of the organization. How each can be measured should be a consideration for the board and the CEO. If used as a measurement, they need to be measurable. Make ends reasonable. Some ends are not within the direct control of the organization, but the organization may be able to reasonably affect those ends. Some of the association's ends goals are somewhat qualitative, but many organizations exist for just such purposes. Measurement may not be easy, but remember what George Gallup said, anything can be measured, it's just a matter of cost. With limited budgets, sometimes boards have to rely on subjective data. Remember, you can assign numbers, you can assign time frames, and short-term ends are an option. In your policy manual, ends are in Section 1 of the policies. Here is a tool that Bill Charney has provided, the ENDS checklist. First, is it within the WSPA's span of control to achieve or effect? Is there a need not otherwise met for our members? Is it realistic and achievable within currently existing or attainable resources, both in terms of time and money? Is it a what benefit statement, not a how statement? Would this potential ends be acceptable, if not desirable, by the members? Should this be one of the board's top concerns, which of course is a function of worth? Principle 7. Proscribe, don't prescribe. Policy governance states that the best, most effective method of controlling staff activity is to set limits and latitude, proscribe, not how-tos, prescribe. Stay out of staff's means except to say what is unacceptable. Describe what is not okay. This gives the CEO a lot of freedom, and this can help streamline operations. But the only freedom the CEO has is the freedom given by the board. The CEO has power, but only as much power as the board allows. Consider this illustration to see how the process works. If the red lines above represent the means utilized by the CEO, and the white lines are the executive limitations policies, if the CEO is staying within the lines and we are seeing inappropriate activity, the board should adjust the executive limitations. And then the CEO must adjust the activities to stay within the board's boundaries of appropriate means. The other key point of governance is we need to achieve the ends we desire. If the CEO stays within the boundaries and achieves the ends, this by definition is successful performance. Also, as we monitor throughout the year, the CEO knows on an ongoing basis if he or she is meeting board expectations. Those boundaries we just talked about are the executive limitations, or limitations on staff means. They describe what the CEO cannot do. The CEO can use any means to achieve the ends as long as the executive limitations are not violated. Although phrased in a negative manner, they are actually recognized by CEOs as being quite freeing. Here's an example. If the ends were to get to this meeting by 1 p.m. today, what typically happens to the CEO when the board doesn't operate under a policy governance model? Well, generally, there are a lot of questions. Is it okay if I don't arrive by car? Do I have to drive alone? Can I arrive a day early? The CEO often has to get confirmation so as to avoid getting to the meeting in a way that the board finds is unacceptable. versus operating under policy governance where we might say, don't get here more than 1 day early and don't take Interstate 90. With policy governance, the CEO already knows what's unacceptable. Here is our global executive limitations policy. The CEO shall not cause nor allow any practice, activity, decision, or organizational circumstance that is either unlawful, imprudent, or in violation of commonly accepted business and professional ethics. As is the case with global ends, executive limitations follow the nested set format, and all other limitations follow under the global executive limits policy. We of course get more specific. A word of caution, when you get more specific, don't get so caught up looking at the specifics that you forget to look back at the more general executive limitations. Sometimes the more generally worded limitations are perfectly adequate. These are second-tier executive limitations. Each of these can be made and have been made more specific at the board's discretion. Things like financial and asset protection get much more specific than grants and contracts, for example. In our policy manual, executive limitations are in Section 2. Principle 8, the authorship of policies. A board must explicitly design its own products, and it must explicitly design its own policies. It's vital that we recognize that these are our policies. Policy governance is not a cookie-cutter governance model, but rather a custom-built tool for the governance of our organization. The Global Governance Process Policy defines the board's purpose. The purpose of the board, on behalf of pharmacists and the pharmacy community of Washington, is to see to it that the WSPA achieves appropriate results for appropriate recipients at an appropriate cost. These are the ends of the organization. The board also assures that the WSPA avoids unacceptable actions and situations, which are defined in the executive limitations. There are several things the board is responsible for producing. The first is linkage, which is needs assessment and advocacy between the WSPA and the Washington pharmacy community. Linkage is not always easy. You have to make yourself available to the membership. We encourage local meeting attendance, but there are other means to establish linkage. The key is keeping in touch with the membership. What else is the board responsible for? Policies setting clear standards for all aspects of organizational performance, assurance of staff performance in accordance with board policies. Let's talk about what you do if the staff does not perform. When we established the policy, were we reasonable in the first place? If the policy was not within the span of control, or at least something WSPA could affect, it would be unfair to hold the CEO accountable. If we were reasonable, then we need to establish a time frame for corrective action at the very least. The extreme other end of the spectrum is canceling the CEO's contract. The board has also established it is responsible for making determinations about legislative or regulatory effects to be sought by the WSPA. How is the agenda formulated? The chair is in charge of setting the agenda. Any board member can add a topic to the agenda by notifying the chair 15 days in advance of the next meeting, or it can be added by a 2/3 majority vote. Or you can ask the chair to include it at the meeting, but the chair is under no obligation to do so. What are the individual responsibilities of board members? I encourage you to look these up. They can be found in Policy 4.5 and 4.6 in your policy manual. What is the role of board committees? Let's take a closer look at this one. The WSPA has two types of committees: staff committees, the ones our members are most familiar with, and board committees. Board committees exist to help the board do its job, and they always report to the board, not to the CEO. Unless otherwise stated, board committees are not empowered to do the board's job, but rather assist the board. Board committees have only the authority that the board gives them. A board committee does not direct the CEO. Standing committees of the board are few and are listed in our policies. We also utilize ad hoc committees. These are short-term committees created for a specific goal. Their charge is generally described in the minutes of the meeting, and once they have accomplished their tasks, they cease to exist. At least one board member must be on a board committee, but not all committee members must be board members. Principle 9. A board's linkage with the staff must be empowering and safe. Certainly we give the CEO a great deal of autonomy. We also agree as a board to interact with the CEO in a manner consistent with our policies. So the CEO has power to act and is safe from unfair scrutiny or inappropriate interference by individual board members. The board's sole connection to the operational organization is through the CEO, who is accountable for achievement of ends and compliance with executive limitations. This should not be interpreted as meaning board members will not have significant interaction with staff. This interaction could be very involved. It does mean you will refrain from directing staff, however, as this is the CEO's responsibility. Under this structure, it is spelled out that the staff does not have two bosses, both board and CEO. They are accountable only to the CEO. Now, if their performance causes the organization to not meet the ends or causes executive limitations to be violated, then the CEO is accountable to the board for their performance. While the board establishes the broadest policies about ends and executive limitations, further decisions belong to the CEO. Remember the nested set of bowls. The CEO has a lot of latitude, but only so much latitude as the board allows. Viewed from the top, these bowls would look something like this. The area inside the inner circles represent the CGO and the CEO areas of discretion. Note the term CGO refers to the Chief Governance Officer. In our board, this is the President, who also serves as the board chair. Key board staff linkage policies. How does the board delegate to staff? Through the CEO. What are the job products of the CEO? Ends and executive limitation compliance. How will evaluations take place? Via monitoring reports. The board will engage in constant monitoring throughout the year. The board can monitor any policy at any time, for any reason, and by any means, but ordinarily it will rely upon an annual monitoring schedule, which is described in Policy 3.4 in your manual. It's very important to note that other than perhaps the financial reports, the board does not necessarily have to spend any meeting time discussing the monitoring reports. If there's a deficiency or suspected deficiency, then a board member has the responsibility to see to it that that monitoring report in question is placed on the agenda for the next meeting. At that point, the board can discuss the alleged violation and make a determination. It is assumed that if no board action is taken on a report, that the report is accepted as satisfactory evidence of compliance with the policy being monitored. Principle 10, Monitoring Performance. A CEO's performance must be monitored rigorously, but only against policy criteria. If the policy criteria change, we do not hold the CEO accountable for the new criteria retrospectively. In all cases, we use a reasonable person test, and the board determines what is reasonable. Let's review our job products. Linkage with ownership. Written governing policies, which includes ends, executive limitations, governance process, and board management delegation. Assurance of executive performance, and legislative and regulatory advocacy. We need to note that this is broad legislative advocacy, not because of policy governance per se, but rather because that's how we've elected to address legislative advocacy. So for example, we may state we support a legal change that requires barcode scanning capability in every pharmacy by a certain date. Great. That's the board's job, and they can get more specific if they want to, but once they've articulated what they want, the CEO takes over and has a degree of latitude to get acceptable results. Let's talk a little bit more about agendas. Our board's job description drives our perpetual agenda, which dictates that we as a board examine every policy continuously. We set an annual agenda to assure that we cover all issues and policies that need to come up before the board in the upcoming year. And of course, we set agendas for each meeting. The key point here is the board sets its own agenda, not the CEO. However, this does not mean that the CEO does not give significant input. The board should most definitely seek CEO input. We act as a board a few days out of the year. The CEO is our CEO every day. So what should you expect? Let's start at the end of the last meeting. 2 weeks after the last meeting, policy changes and minutes will come via email in draft form. Committee work will be ongoing. These may include policy proposals. Monitoring reports are evaluated in between meetings. Input for the next agenda is sent to the chair about 1 month out. Look for discussion topics, committee proposals, policy violation notices, if any. The deadline is 2 weeks. Board packets are sent out approximately 10 days prior to the meeting. Looking at the meeting agenda, the first topic is confirmation of receipt of the monitoring reports. The purpose here is to get on the record that the board has done its fiduciary duty to monitor the CEO. The presumption is that the board critically reads the reports and evaluates if satisfactory performance has been achieved, and unless a board member indicates a violation, the board accepts the report as satisfactory proof of compliance with the policy. Next comes minutes approval. Then ends discussion, which can include discussion topics. Presentations are usually ends associated, and the board can determine at that time if any action is needed on that particular topic. Acting on proposals. Wordsmithing should be done between meetings ideally, as our time together is limited. If ends are included in a monitoring report, are the ends stated in such a manner that we accomplish what we desire? The last one involves ends, not monitoring. Did the CEO achieve the ends, but in a way that didn't really match what the board desired? If so, a revision may be necessary. Other meeting topics are CEO reports, committee reports, executive sessions. In our executive sessions, the CEO is generally present, although the CEO may be excused while the board deliberates. Executive session is confidential, always. We may discuss other policy issues. Board self-evaluation is generally included to determine if we've followed our own policies and focused on the ends.
WSPA Board of Directors members, thank you so much for spending the time watching this video. It really helps when we all come together with the same idea of how to govern the association. Now is your proof that you've watched the video. You'll get to record later on at our meeting what song I'm singing. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Thank you.
I hope this session has been helpful. The slides and notes are available to you in written form through our office upon request. I believe you'll find policy governance to be a very useful tool for our board. It's just a tool to help you. The real work is not so much learning the details of the policies, but rather learning to focus on the direction for the WSPA. The policies are written down. They're easy to look up. The critical thinking that helps us to eventually develop our policies is where the real focus needs to lie. Good luck, and by all means, if you have any questions regarding our governance structure and how to use it, ask for help. I'd like to thank Bill Charney of Charney & Associates for the descriptions and examples he provided us on the topic of policy governance that we've applied in this presentation for our board.